Have you ever noticed how some people don't panic when everyone else is falling apart? You've seen it happen. Some catastrophe hits, the room erupts, people spiral, people freeze. People dramatically announce that they simply cannot go on, as if the universe called an audition and they showed up rehearsed. But then there's that one person, sitting quietly in the corner, not panicking, not screaming, not posting about their trauma response on social media, just handling it, calm in a way that almost seems wrong, still in a way that reads as cold, until you realize it's something else entirely. It's not just fearlessness. It's not just bravery. It's not even emotional stability in the textbook sense. It's something nobody talks about at dinner parties, because it's too real, and real things make people who grew up comfortable extremely uncomfortable. These people, the quiet ones, the loners, the ones who seemed strange and withdrawn and a little too self-contained, they didn't get there by accident. They got there through something the world has a terrible habit of romanticizing when it's convenient, and completely ignoring when it isn't. They got there through surviving things that most people will genuinely never have to face. And this is not a feel-good piece. This isn't about healing crystals, gratitude journals, or rebranding your worst years as your glow-up era. This is about looking directly at what actually happened to a very specific kind of person and calling it what it is. This is about psychological endurance that most people never build because they never had to. Let's talk about the people who grew up in normal homes. And before we go further, let's be very clear. Normal is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The stability-raised person grew up with something most trauma-born loners never got to experience as a baseline. The assumption that things would be okay, that if something broke, it would get fixed, that if something was said in anger, it would get addressed, that the emotional temperature of the room wouldn't change without warning and without reason. They grew up believing that security is the default. And look, that's beautiful. Nobody should fault them for that. But here's what happened to those people the moment real chaos arrived. They collapsed. Not because they're weak, but because they were never built for it. Their nervous system had no reference point. Their identity had no toolkit. And so when unpredictability arrived, when the ground moved under their feet, they didn't know what to do with their hands. They developed panic. They lost identity. They reached for anything familiar, even if it was harmful, because the unfamiliar was simply too much for a system that was never trained on it. You didn't choose to become someone who functions in unpredictability. Nobody sits a child down and says, "Hey, we're going to run you through some advanced emotional instability training today." Nobody opts in. But when your baseline is chaos, mild stress doesn't destabilize you. Because mild stress, to someone raised in a storm, is just weather. It's not that you love storms, it's that you were raised in one. And now everyone's impressed you can handle rain. The interesting psychological truth here, and this is where it gets dark, is that the stability-raised person genuinely doesn't understand why they crumble at things that don't seem to move you. And from the outside, look like something between superhuman and emotionally unavailable, when actually, you're just calibrated differently. Running on a different operating system, one that was installed under conditions most people will never face. You didn't become hard. You became honest about how hard things actually are. Here's something that makes comfortable people very uncomfortable when you say it out loud. Not everyone encounters manipulation as a rare, shocking, traumatic event. For some people, manipulation was the primary language spoken at home. Not as an exception, as a method. Gaslighting. Not the word of the year kind, the actual kind, where you know what happened, you were there, you watched it. And then someone you trusted looked you dead in the eyes and told you, with full confidence, that none of that occurred, and then waited to see if you'd believe them. Power games, emotional reversals, the hot and cold cycle that kept you perpetually off balance, perpetually reaching, perpetually confused about whether you were the problem, or the source of the problem, or the entire problem entirely. Most people encounter this once, from a bad partner, a toxic boss, an ex they won't stop talking about in therapy. And they are shaken for years. Some people encountered it repeatedly, from the people who were supposed to be safe. And here's what's strange about that, genuinely philosophically strange. It taught something that no class, no seminar, no pop psychology book ever could. It taught pattern recognition. Not academically, not theoretically, viscerally, in the gut. In the exact way a person learns to recognize a gas leak. Not by reading about it, but by having nearly passed out from one before. Someone who experiences manipulation once internalizes the confusion, loses grip on their own perception, spends years in therapy rebuilding trust in their own mind. You learn to notice the inconsistency in real time. You catch the subtle dominance shift mid-sentence. You read the hidden agenda before the conversation is even over. You can tell when someone's tone doesn't match their words. You can feel it now when a conversation is being steered. You notice when someone's story changes slightly, not because you're paranoid, but because your brain was trained on inconsistency and learned to flag it like a security system. That sounds clinical. It wasn't clinical to live, but the result, on the other side, is a perceptiveness that genuinely unsettles people who've never had to develop it. People think you're reading their minds. You're not. You're reading their behavior, the way only someone who had to actually learns to. You weren't meant to become naive. Life made sure of that. And you became perceptive instead. Some people paid for their wisdom in classrooms. You paid for yours somewhere else entirely. Let's talk about something everyone claims to fear, and almost nobody has actually experienced in its full weight. Loneliness, real loneliness, not the Saturday night kind. Not the I didn't get invited to the thing kind. Not the kind that gets a sympathetic response when you post about it. The kind where you are emotionally and completely alone in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, where you are surrounded by noise, and still, the silence inside is so loud you learn to live inside it, where you realize, at an age when you should be learning multiplication tables, that no one in this room actually knows who you are. And more disturbingly, no one has thought to ask. Most people fear prolonged loneliness the way they fear deep water. From a distance, with an escape plan nearby, they'll tolerate a weekend alone. Maybe two. And then they're on the phone making plans, filling the space with anything that moves. You experienced it early, and for longer than anyone should have, and you did something with it that's genuinely rare. You learned to sit with yourself. Not just as a spiritual practice, not because you read something wise about solitude, but because you had no other option, and the alternative was to lose yourself entirely. Most people, when forced into isolation, spiral into dependency. They abandon themselves to gain access to belonging. They accept mistreatment just to not be alone, because the silence feels like a verdict. You built an interior world instead, developed a relationship with your own thoughts, stopped needing the room's approval to feel real. There's a psychological concept that describes what happens when a person stops borrowing their identity from the crowd and starts building one that belongs only to them. It's a painful process, disorienting. It requires confronting the parts of yourself that the group never reflected back. The parts that were too inconvenient, too strange, too much. Most people avoid it their entire lives. Not because they're cowards, but because they never had enough pressure applied to force the question. They stayed comfortable inside the collective. They never had to find out who they were without it. Carl Jung called this individuation, and he was very clear as it costs something. It requires a kind of psychological separation that feels at first like loss, like exile. Most people choose it late, after decades of living someone else's version of themselves, if they choose it at all. You were pushed into it before you had a name for what was happening. You were forced into individuation before you knew there was a name for it. Most people choose it late, or never. And now, here you are, someone who genuinely does not need to perform for a room to feel okay. Someone who can be alone, not because you've given up, but because you found yourself in the silence and decided to stay. The world finds that threatening. People who don't need approval, unsettled people who've built their whole lives around giving it. The silence that broke other people became the only place you actually heard yourself. There's a very particular kind of exhaustion that only people who grew up too fast actually know, and it's not the exhaustion of being tired. It's the exhaustion of carrying weight that had someone else's name on it. Some trauma-born loners became, without ceremony, without consent, the emotional manager of rooms they didn't create, the stabilizer, the one who noticed when the temperature was rising, the one who quietly, strategically, became whatever the moment needed, so that things wouldn't get worse, so that someone else wouldn't lose it, so that the people who were supposed to be holding things together would hold things together, at least a little while longer. That's not childhood. That's a job. With no contract, no pay, no weekends. And when normal people who actually got to just be kids, encounter burden that exceeds their capacity, they collapse. They find someone to carry them. They reach for support they believe they're entitled to, because they were taught they'd always have it. You did something different. When the weight exceeded what you could hold, you didn't find a way out of it. You found a way to expand. You got bigger on the inside. Your capacity stretched in ways that left marks, but also left capability. There's a harder version of this idea that most people skip over because it's inconvenient. The idea that suffering doesn't automatically build anything. That plenty of people suffer and come out smaller. Bitter, closed. That the suffering itself isn't the variable. What matters is what gets done with it, whether it gets processed or buried, whether it becomes fuel or sediment. Nietzsche understood this, and he was careful about it in a way people often miss when they quote him. He wasn't saying pain makes you stronger. He was saying that some people, under specific conditions, find a way to integrate what hurt them, and that integration produces something real, something that couldn't have been built any other way. The difference was never the suffering itself. Everyone suffers. The difference was what you were forced to do with yours, because nobody was coming to take it from you. That expansion cost you something real. It cost you softness. It cost you some of the lightness that people who grew up protected still carry around in their 30s, like something they've never thought to question. It cost you the assumption that someone will always catch you. But it built endurance, actual bone-level tested endurance, and that is not nothing. You were handed a weight meant for someone older. You carried it anyway. That's not just inspiration. That's just what happened. Here's the part that most people don't see, and genuinely couldn't see, because they've never had to look at it. Most people form their identity the comfortable way. They have mirrors around them. People who reflect back who they are, with warmth and consistency. They have feedback. You're good at this. You're kind. You matter here. They have encouragement that arrives without them having to earn it, because that's what encouragement is supposed to be. Freely given, reliably present. And through all of that, and slowly, an identity forms, stable, recognized, externally confirmed. Now ask yourself what happens when that entire scaffolding disappears. When the mirrors show nothing useful. When the feedback is inconsistent, or cruel, or simply absent. When you are left, at the age of forming yourself, with no confirmation that what you're building is real, most people, placed into that situation, either borrow someone else's identity to fill the void, or they fragment entirely. You did neither. You did something philosophically extraordinary. You turned inward. You asked yourself, without a guide, without a template, without anyone to confirm the answer, who am I without validation? Who am I without safety? Who am I when no one in this room has decided I'm worth confirming? Those are not casual questions. Philosophers have spent careers orbiting those questions. Entire psychological traditions have built frameworks around helping people answer them in comfortable offices, with carefully trained professionals over years of structured work. You answered them alone in the quiet, under conditions that were not designed for self-discovery, and surviving identity fragmentation, not once but repeatedly, and still arriving on the other side with a self that is yours, that you authored, that no one handed you. That is what psychologists call self-authorship, and most people never achieve it, because most people never got there. You built yourself from scratch in the dark with no instructions, and somehow it held. This last one is the quietest one, and somehow that makes it the sharpest. When most people experience emotional pain, acute, overwhelming, destabilizing pain, something happens that they almost never register as the gift that it is. Someone comes, a parent, a friend, a partner, a teacher. Someone notices that the system is overloading, and they step in. They say, "Quote, I'm here," and they mean it. And their presence actually does something. It calms the nervous system. It signals you are not alone in this. The storm will end. Most people have had that, and they don't know they had it, because they've never lived without it. You often didn't have it. And what happened next is what nobody tells you. When no one comes, you don't simply wait indefinitely, you adapt. The nervous system, which is adaptive in ways that are almost unsettling, finds another path. You learn to regulate yourself. Not elegantly at first, not cleanly, but you learn. You develop the ability to think through the overwhelm, not around it, through it. To sit inside a feeling that would send someone else reaching for the nearest available distraction, and to wait, and to survive the waiting. That kind of self-regulation under pressure is rare, not in the inspirational poster sense. In the clinical, measurable, psychological sense, it is a skill that is genuinely hard to teach, because it can't really be taught from the outside. It has to be forged from the inside, under conditions that most people would categorize as neglect, and most people would be right. But the result is a person who doesn't need emotional scaffolding to get through hard days. A person who can feel things fully and not be destroyed by the feeling. A person who has essentially already faced the worst version of being alone inside a feeling and discovered they could come out the other side. That's not emotional suppression. That's emotional endurance. And the difference matters more than most people realize. Nobody came, so you became the person who comes for yourself. Every single time. And here is what that difference produces. Practically quietly in the real world. You don't fear being alone. You've lived there. You know its geography. You don't fear starting over. You've started from worse than zero. You don't fear walking away. You've survived the leaving already. You don't fear losing approval. You've functioned without it, not because you're just invincible, not because nothing hurts, but because you have actual experiential data stored in your body that tells you you already survived worse. And that data doesn't go away. It sits underneath everything. A quiet, unremarkable confidence that most people can't manufacture, no matter how many motivational frameworks they consume. Most people admire resilience in theory. They post about it, they buy books about it, they watch videos about it, nodding along, thinking about that one hard day they had, the day they like to reference as their defining struggle. But resilience isn't a concept, it's a scar. It's the specific shape your psychology took after being pressed against something that was trying to break it. It has texture, it has weight, it has a price that was paid in real time, in real years, by a real nervous system that did not ask for the training program it was enrolled in. You survive things that would have badly reshaped someone else completely, and they would not be wrong to have been reshaped. Because what you went through was the kind of thing that reshapes people. You adapted where others would have fractured. Not because the universe selected you for a hero's journey. The universe doesn't do that. The universe is not that considerate. You adapted because you were in the water and you learned to swim. Because not swimming was not a surviving option. And once someone learns they can survive alone, something changes permanently. If this resonated with you, hit that like button to let others know that it's true. Subscribe for more deep dives into psychology, philosophy, and the stuff nobody else wants to talk about. Welcome home, my dear friends.